It was 14 degrees when the shivering finally stopped. That is the terrifying stage of hypothermia where the human body simply gives up. Shoved onto the street with nothing but a canvas jacket, David faced a brutal November trapped inside the rotting belly of a fallen western red cedar. The eviction notice was taped to the door with an offensive amount of heavy-duty packing tape. It was November 12th, and the sky over Aberdeen, Washington was the color of a bruised knee, leaking a steady, freezing sleet. David Harrison stood on the concrete landing of his second-story apartment, staring at the legal jargon stamped with the logo of Pacific Evergreen Holdings. He had 30 minutes to vacate. "I told you on Tuesday, Harrison," came a voice from the bottom of the stairs. It was Richard Cobb, the regional property manager. Cobb was a man who seemed to genuinely enjoy the misery of his tenants, his thick neck flushed red against the collar of his expensive North Face parka. The grace period was over on the 10th. The sheriff's deputy is waiting in the cruiser. You grab what you can carry, or we throw it in the dumpster. David was 34, a former structural drafter whose life had unraveled in a spectacular 6-month spiral. Following a severe car accident involving an uninsured commercial truck, David had drowned in medical debt. His savings evaporated, his job let him go after his physical therapy took too long, and his credit score flatlined. He had begged Cobb for one more week. He had a prospective job interview at a lumber mill coming up. Cobb didn't care. With shaking hands, David shoved 3 pairs of socks, a flashlight, a hunting knife he'd inherited from his grandfather, and a lighter into a faded canvas duffel bag. He didn't even have time to grab his heavy winter coat, which was currently locked inside the dry cleaners across town, a place he couldn't afford to retrieve it from. He wore only a flannel shirt, jeans, and a waxed canvas jacket. By the time he hit the pavement, the sleet had turned into a driving, icy rain. Davey pulled out his phone, 3% battery. He dialed Greg Simmons, a guy he had considered his best friend for a decade. Greg had promised him his couch if things ever got truly bad. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. David texted, "Cobb kicked me out. Need that couch." The response came 3 minutes later, right before the phone screen died for good. "Man, I am so sorry. Sarah's parents are in town, staying in the living room. Can't do it tonight. Try a shelter?" There were no shelters in Aberdeen with open beds. He had checked the week prior when the warning arrived. The nearest facility with funding was 50 miles away in Olympia. With the cold seeping through his boots, David started walking. He walked to keep his blood pumping, heading east along Highway 101, away from the biting wind whipping off the Grays Harbor waters. As the afternoon bled into a charcoal evening, the rain transitioned into heavy, wet snow. The temperature plummeted. Vehicles roared past him, their tires kicking up slush that coated his jeans. By nightfall, David realized he was going to die if he didn't find cover. He had veered off the highway near the edge of the Olympic National Forest, stumbling up an old, overgrown logging road. The timber here was ancient, choked with ferns and draped in heavy, wet moss. His flashlight flickered, the batteries dying. In the dim yellow beam, he saw it. It was a western red cedar, uprooted during a violent storm decades ago. The tree was monstrous, easily 10 feet in diameter. The core of the trunk had succumbed to heart rot, leaving a massive, gaping cavern at the base. It looked like the open mouth of a subterranean beast. Desperation overrode any fear of bears or cougars. David crawled inside. The air in the hollow log was stale, smelling intensely of dry peat, old wood, and animal musk, but it was remarkably dry. The thick walls of the ancient cedar blocked the biting wind. David curled his body into a tight ball, pulling his knees to his chest. He flicked his lighter, hoping to start a small fire with the dry wood dust, but his hands were trembling so violently he dropped it into the darkness. He spent an hour blindly searching the debris for the small plastic rectangle, but it was gone. That first night was an agonizing education in suffering. The cold did not just sit on his skin, it drove itself into his bones like rusty nails. He shivered until his abdominal muscles cramped in agony. He gnawed on the inside of his cheek just to focus on a different kind of pain. He drifted in and out of a terrifying hallucinatory sleep, waking every few hours convinced his heart had stopped. When morning finally broke, filtering a weak grey light through the entrance of the log, David dragged himself out. His joints popped and cracked, his breath hung in the air like thick smoke. He had survived night 1, but looking up at the heavy, snow-laden clouds, he knew night 2 would be colder. By the 5th day, David's reality had narrowed to a sharp, agonizing point of basic survival. He had not eaten a single calorie. He had attempted to forage, but the underbrush was buried in snow and the few berries he recognized were long gone. He survived by drinking water from a nearby half-frozen creek, a process that chilled his core temperature so severely he had to spend hours huddled in his cedar log just to regain feeling in his fingers. His clothes were perpetually damp. The canvas jacket, once a stylish autumn layer, was a stiff frozen shell. The hollow log which had saved his life on the first night was now effectively a wooden icebox. Without a fire, the ambient temperature inside the log hovered just above 20 degrees. On the morning of November 18th, hunger drove him further up the mountain ridge than he had dared to go before. He was lightheaded, his vision swimming with dark spots. Every step through the knee-deep snow required a massive act of willpower. That was when he smelled it. Wood smoke. A surge of adrenaline hit his system. He crested a ridge and looked down into a small ravine. Nestled against a rocky outcropping was a large, camouflage canvas tent. A small fire smoldered in a ring of stones, a heavy cast-iron pot sitting beside it. David's first instinct was to run down and beg for help. But as he crept closer, hiding behind a thick Douglas fir, he noticed the gruesome details. Hanging from a makeshift rig between 2 trees were the fresh, bloody carcasses of 3 Roosevelt elk out of season and explicitly illegal to hunt in this protected territory. These weren't campers, they were poachers. Voices echoed from the woods to the north. "Told you, Kenny, if that game warden comes nosing around the South Ridge again, we drop him. I'm not doing federal time over some meat." The voice was gruff, terrifyingly casual about murder. David froze. He watched as 2 men trudged into the camp. One, presumably Kenny, was a tall, wire-thin man carrying a high-powered hunting rifle. The other, the one who had spoken, was heavily built with a thick, graying beard, a man David would later learn was an infamous local outlaw known only as Dutch. David knew if they caught him spying on their illegal operation, they would shoot him and leave him in a ditch. He needed to retreat, but his eyes locked onto a wooden crate sitting just outside the tent flap. On top of it sat a thick, foil-lined thermal emergency blanket, a half-empty plastic jar of peanut butter, and a worn, leather-bound notebook. Hunger and cold are a potent combination that easily overwhelms logic. As Dutch and Kenny stepped inside the tent to escape the wind, zipping the flap shut, David made his move. He moved with the silent, desperate speed of a starved animal. He reached the crate, grabbed the peanut butter, stuffed the heavy foil blanket under his arm and, almost as an afterthought, snatched the leather-bound book, thinking he could use the paper for fire tinder if he ever found his lighter. He didn't make a sound, but as he turned to run, his boot snapped a brittle, frozen twig hidden under the snow. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent ravine. "Hey!" Dutch's voice roared from inside the tent. The zipper ripped open. David ran. He didn't look back. He heard the heavy crunch of boots giving chase, followed by a string of vicious curses. "Get the rifle, Kenny. Someone's in the camp." David tore through the forest, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the sharp branches whipping across his face. He scrambled down steep embankments, sliding on his stomach through the snow, using his knowledge of the terrain he'd wandered for 5 days to lose them. He zigzagged wildly until he reached his logging road, diving into the hollow mouth of his cedar log. just as a distant rifle shot echoed through the trees. A bullet tore through the canopy high above, showering him with pine needles. He scrambled deep into the back of the hollow cavity, pressing his back against the damp wood. He was safe from their line of sight, but he was entirely trapped. 10 minutes later, he heard the crunching of snow. They were tracking his footprints. "Tracks end around here." Kenny's voice drifted through the timber, dangerously close. "Snow's too fresh, wind's blowing it over. Check those deadfalls," Dutch ordered. His voice sounded like gravel. Inside the log, David faced a fatal problem. The sprint had caused him to sweat. Now, lying motionless in the freezing darkness, that sweat was rapidly cooling. His core temperature plummeted. His body began to betray him. The shivering started, not a gentle tremble, but violent, full-body convulsions. His teeth began to chatter, like castanets. In the dead silence of the winter forest, the rhythmic clack, clack of his teeth and the rustling of his frozen jacket against the wood was deafening. If they walked past the log, they would hear him. He clamped his jaw shut, but the shivering in his chest was so violent it felt like his ribs were breaking. He was losing control. In the pitch black, his hands brushed against the leather-bound book he had stolen. Desperate to distract himself from the freezing agony, he cracked it open. A sliver of weak light from the log's entrance illuminated the pages. It wasn't a standard journal. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten notes, diagrams of the human nervous system, and military stamps. The name on the inside cover read, Sergeant Carl William Hayes, USMC/Winter Survival Doctrine. But the entry David had opened to wasn't about building snow caves or foraging. It was a dense, heavily underlined chapter titled G-Tumo, the Subjugation of the Cold via Internal Fire. David read the first paragraph, his eyes struggling to focus as his body shook. Hypothermia begins in the mind's panic. The Tibetan ascetics survive sub-zero temperatures, not through heavy garments but through vascular control. By altering the respiratory rate and utilizing absolute visualization, the practitioner forces the body to ignite brown adipose tissue, creating an internal furnace. The shivering must be stopped consciously. Shivering is the body's chaotic defense. The breath is the disciplined defense. "Check that big cedar up ahead," Dutch's voice barked, now less than 50 yards away. Panic seized David. He couldn't stop shaking. His jacket rustled loudly. He was going to be found, dragged out, and executed. The breath is the disciplined defense. With the heavy footsteps crunching closer, David closed his eyes in the dark. He had nothing left to lose. He forced his jaw shut so hard a tooth cracked. He focused entirely on his diaphragm. Inhale deeply. Expand the stomach, not the chest. He drew in a massive breath of freezing air, holding it. Swallow the breath. Push it down to the pelvic floor. Compress it. He forced the air downward, clenching his core muscles. The textbook had said to visualize a flame at the base of the spine. David visualized a blast furnace. He held the breath until his vision sparked with colors, then exhaled slowly through pursed lips. Inhale. Compress. Ignite. Exhale. Dutch's heavy boots stopped right outside the entrance of the log. "Looks hollow," the poacher muttered. David held his breath, compressing his core, focusing every ounce of his dying cognitive function on the base of his spine. Miraculously, the violent shivering paused. For a span of 30 seconds, his body went completely rigid and utterly silent. He felt a bizarre, tiny prickle of warmth deep in his abdomen. Dutch kicked the side of the log. The boom vibrated through David's skull. "Nothing in here but rot," Dutch said, his voice muffled by the thick wood. "Little rat must have crossed the creek. Let's head back. If he's out here in this weather without a pack, the cold will kill him by midnight anyway." The footsteps slowly faded away. David exhaled, his lungs burning. He had survived the immediate threat, But as he looked out at the fading light and the fresh snow beginning to fall, he realized Dutch was right. The cold was going to kill him, unless, David thought, staring down at the leather journal in the gloom, he could learn how to keep the fire burning. The interior of the cedar log became a tomb of absolute black as the sun dipped beneath the Olympic Mountains. The temperature plummeted into the mid-teens. The storm outside escalated, the wind howling through the canopy, violently shaking the ancient timber. Inside, David Harrison was fighting a war on two fronts, the agonizing cold threatening to shut down his organs and the crushing, suffocating weight of his own panic. His muscles ached with a deep lactic acid burn from the violent shivering that he had forcibly suppressed while the poachers were near. Now the shivering threatened to return with a vengeance. He knew that if he surrendered to it tonight, he would not wake up. With trembling, stiff fingers, he felt the items he had stolen. The heavy foil survival blanket was a godsend. He awkwardly wrapped it around his shoulders, trapping what little radiant heat his body was still producing. Then he grabbed the plastic jar of peanut butter. He tried to twist the lid, but it was sealed shut, the oils inside frozen rock solid. He cursed into the darkness, his voice a dry, rasping croak. He shoved the jar inside his jacket, pressing it against his sternum, hoping his meager body heat would thaw it enough to consume the life-saving calories. He opened the journal of Sergeant William Hayes again. He clicked his dead flashlight, praying for a miracle. The bulb gave a faint, sickly yellow pulse for 3 seconds before dying completely. In those 3 seconds, David burned a single diagram into his memory. A drawing of the human torso with a concentrated ball of energy located 2 inches beneath the navel, with arrows pulling oxygen down and pushing heat outward. Phase breathing. The words from the text echoed in his mind, the retention of the breath in the lower abdomen expanding the pelvic floor, creating a pressurized vessel. It is the friction of the breath against the nervous system that commands the brown fat to ignite. David closed his eyes. The darkness was disorienting. His mind began to fracture under the stress, serving up vivid hallucinations. He saw his old apartment bathed in warm golden light. He saw Richard Cobb laughing by a roaring fireplace. He saw his grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, a hardened veteran of the Ardennes offensive, standing in the snow, looking down at him with grave disappointment. "You have the knife, Davy," his grandfather's phantom voice seemed to say. "But you forgot how to fight." "I haven't forgotten," David whispered through chattering teeth. He tightened the foil blanket around himself. He sat cross-legged, ignoring the screaming protests of his joints. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth, just behind his front teeth, exactly as the fleeting text had instructed. He took a slow, agonizingly deep breath in through his nose. He bypassed his chest, forcing his diaphragm down, pushing his stomach out. The freezing air burned his trachea like swallowed glass. He held it, he bore down, engaging his abdominal muscles, compressing the air into the bottom of his stomach. He visualized the shape from the journal, a sphere of pressure. 10 seconds passed. His lungs screamed for release. The instinct to exhale and gasp for more air was overwhelming. Panic flared, telling him he was suffocating himself. But Sergeant Hayes' words anchored him. Hypothermia begins in the mind's panic. David held the breath for 20 seconds. He visualized a glowing ember at the base of his spine. He imagined the compressed oxygen feeding it. He focused entirely on the image of a blacksmith's bellows forcing air into a furnace. He released the breath slowly with a sharp, controlled hiss through his lips. Zzz! He immediately drew in another breath. Deep, heavy, bypassing the chest. Compress. Hold. Visualize the ember glowing brighter, turning from dull red to a sharp, angry orange. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. The cold continued to bite through his jeans. His toes felt like blocks of wood. The spare began to seep back in, a quiet, seductive voice telling him it was okay to just lie down. to let the sleep take him. It would be painless eventually. But then, on his 50th cycle of breath, a strange sensation bloomed just below his navel. It wasn't a roaring fire. It was a subtle, distinct prickle of warmth, no larger than a coin. It felt like a drop of hot tea hitting an empty stomach. David's eyes shot open in the dark. A jolt of pure, electrifying shock hit his system. It was real. The doctrine wasn't just theory. It was a physiological hack. Driven by this tiny victory, David attacked the breathing with a ferocious, animalistic intensity. Inhale, compress, hold, visualize, exhale. He repeated the cycle for an hour. The tiny coin of warmth expanded. It spread across his abdomen, seeping into his lower back. The violent tremors that had racked his body for days finally ceased, replaced by a steady, humming tension in his muscles. He felt the jar of peanut butter against his chest. He reached in. The outside of the jar was warm. He twisted the lid. It popped open. He dug 2 dirty fingers into the semi-thawed paste and shoved it into his mouth. The explosion of fat, sugar, and salt was the greatest thing he had ever tasted. He ate half the jar in 2 minutes, giving his body the vital fuel it needed to sustain the metabolic furnace he was forcing it to build. By 3 a.m., the temperature outside the log was a lethal 9 degrees. Inside, huddled in his foil blanket, David Harrison was not just surviving. He was radiating heat. He had found the spark in the dark. He had become the fire. Day 8 arrived with blinding, crystalline sunlight reflecting harshly off the 3 feet of fresh snow, blanketing the Olympic National Forest. David crawled out of the hollow cedar. He looked entirely different from the desperate, shivering man evicted a week prior. Gaunt and filthy, his movements were now deliberate. He took slow, rhythmic breaths, maintaining the low-grade internal heat that kept frostbite at bay. The peanut butter was gone, and his body was cannibalizing its own muscle tissue. He had to reach Highway 101, fashioning makeshift snowshoes from pliable cedar branches and canvas strips ripped from his jacket. He began the grueling trek down the mountain. The forest was an eerily silent, frozen cathedral. 2 hours into his descent, a sharp, metallic whine shattered the stillness. David froze, dropping into a crouch behind a snow-covered boulder. Creeping forward, he peered over the top. Less than 50 yards below, blocking the only viable logging road, was the poachers' camp. Their beat-up Ford F-250, loaded with tarp-covered elk meat, was dead. Dutch furiously slammed a wrench against the frozen battery terminals. "The block is frozen solid. We're stuck out here." Dutch roared. Kenny clutched his rifle, terrified. "The radio says a state trooper patrol is sweeping the south access roads today. If they see this rig, we're doing 10 years. Then we walk out and come back for the meat later," Dutch snarled, slamming the hood. "Grab your pack, let's move." Realizing they were leaving on foot down his exact path, David decided to traverse the steep, treacherous ridge above the road to bypass them. He moved with agonizing slowness, testing every step. He was parallel to them when disaster struck. The snow beneath David's left foot gave way. It was a hidden snow bridge covering a deep ravine. With a sharp gasp, David plunged downward, sliding wildly through freezing powder and jagged rocks. He clawed at the embankment, slamming his grandfather's hunting knife into a thick, exposed tree root. His descent jerked to a violent halt, but the avalanche of dislodged snow cascaded directly onto the logging road below. "What the hell was that?" Kenny yelled. "Up there on the ridge," Dutch barked. "Someone's tracking us." David scrambled over the lip of the ravine and ran. A deafening crack ripped through the air. A bullet shattered a pine trunk 2 feet away, showering him in wood shrapnel. The old David would have frozen in terror. The new David, sustained by the deep compression of his breath, felt a terrifying clarity. He deliberately led them away from the road, plunging deeper into a dense, swampy depression known by loggers as a dead zone. The poachers gave chase, their heavy boots plunging through the crust. "I got a shot, Dutch," Kenny yelled. David darted behind a massive fallen log. He took a massive breath, compressing his core, forcing adrenaline into heat. He waited. He heard Kenny panting heavily, rushing closer, blind to the danger beneath his feet. The swampy depression was fed by an underground geothermal spring. The ice was dangerously thin, hidden by fresh snow. Kenny stepped over the log. His foot hit the flat expanse. Instantly, the ice shattered with a loud crack. Kenny screamed as he plunged through, the freezing black swamp water swallowing him to his chest. His rifle flew from his hands, sliding across the ice. The sudden shock caused an immediate, paralyzing gasp reflex. "Dutch! Help! I'm under!" Kenny shrieked, thrashing wildly. Dutch broke through the tree line, stopping at the edge of the fractured ice. He looked at Kenny, then at the rifle 10 feet away. He hesitated. In that moment, David burst from cover, sprinting across the solid embankment. He didn't look back, leaving Dutch cursing, forced to choose between saving his partner or pursuing his prey. David ran for another mile, his lungs burning, his internal furnace firing on all cylinders. He burst through the final tree line and stumbled onto the paved, heavily salted surface of Highway 11. He collapsed onto the asphalt, staring up at the gray sky, chest heaving. 10 minutes later, the flashing lights of a Washington State patrol cruiser cut through the gloom. Officer Brody Kavanaugh rushed out, grabbing a thermal blanket. "Hey, stay with me, buddy," he yelled, wrapping it around David. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance at mile marker 42. Severe exposure victim." "He's ice cold." David looked up, a faint smile breaking across his cracked lips. Beneath the filthy jacket, his core still radiated a profound heat. "I'm not cold, officer," David rasped. "There are 2 poachers trapped in the swamp a mile back. They have illegal elk meat in an F-250 at the logging road." Hours later at Grays Harbor Community Hospital, doctors were baffled. David had lost 15 pounds and suffered mild frostnip, but his core body temperature was a stable 98.6 degrees. Asked how he survived a week in sub-freezing temperatures with no fire, David only pointed to the worn journal on his bedside table. He had mastered the fire within, forging himself into something unbreakable. David Harrison's story proves that the human body holds dormant miracles, waiting for the mind to unlock them. From a freezing eviction to mastering the ancient internal fire, his survival against brutal poachers and deadly hypothermia is a testament to absolute willpower. If this incredible true tale of resilience inspired you, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking survival stories.